Ďakujem veľmi pekne.
Thank you very much indeed, dear Mr. Secretary General, dear Mark. I'm very glad that I was able to receive Mr. Secretary General at the Presidential Palace during his official visit of Slovak Republic as one of the North Atlantic Alliance member states. At the outset, make sure it's very clear, I'd like to emphasize that during our talks we've been very clearly saying that Slovakia is and will be a responsible NATO member state and has no interest in changing its international roots in both NATO and European Union. I'd like to thank Mr. Secretary General for very open and frank discussion, because the two of us have known each other for many years. We've sat together as prime ministers at the European Council's meetings. That's why our relationship allows us to speak very directly with no diplomatic shenanigans around. We do realize that the situation of geopolitics also within the security space has been changing dynamically. But our response, at least here in Europe, should not be some lamenting or complaining, what now? But we, NATO member states and the EU member states, here in Europe, we have to act actively, come with own attitudes and proposals how to resolve the situation, not to complain whether we are or we are not seated at some desk somewhere or not being able to co-decide about our future and that of our neighbor. May I open a few topics, then I'm sure later will be more commented by Secretary General. We have approaching a NATO summit in Hague, which will be preceded by talks of the B9 head of states, at which increased defense expenditure, I'm sure, will be debated, or increased investment into our defense. There is an idea, some percentages, which will still be a matter of talks. However, we must admit, and Slovakia does admit this, that our armed forces have been built into peacetime. They were built in a way that, as though there would never be another war in our continent. So unfortunately today, this is what it looks like. It's the condition and the state of armed forces of European countries. And the war has shown us completely, in a naked truth, that our military forces are not ready here in Europe to face any threat, no matter where from such threat would come. I'm only saying in general. That is why it is a legitimate, open question to increase funding sources for armament of the North Atlantic member states, armies, militaries rather. Here in Slovakia, we look at this from a very pragmatic point of view. We all rely on Article 5, which says that in case of any attack upon a NATO member state, immediately remaining NATO member states come to help. We, from Slovakia's perspective, also look at it from Article 3, which first says that member states are supposed to first be able, through own capacities, capable of repelling any attack, and time will come before Article 5 is activated. And that's important to say to our citizens of our countries, that this is for their security. And it is our obligation, our duty, to build such armed forces capable of resisting any pressure from outside our borders. This is not only about pressure of some military attack, we speaking of counterterrorism. Also, major wave of migration pressures, which must be managed not just police, but the military as well. So we are facing a discussion, and there are two moments important for Slovakia, and I've discussed this with Mr. Secretary General. It is likely that it will be necessary to change fiscal rules of the European Union. which has already been announced by Madam President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, in Munich. Because today the fiscal rules do not enable us, due to deficit and debt threshold, to increase our defense expenditures. That's the first moment, must be preceding discussion about increasing investments into military. Second thing important for Slovakia will be what pace will be proposed by the alliance. In how many years we need to achieve the desired increase by 1 or 1.5% additional, and what pressure this will exercise upon our funding resources. Thirdly, a discussion what will be and will not be included into defense expenditures, such as, we mentioned this already, repairing a bridge. One cannot bear the weight of a tank, Leopard tank, for instance. Is it not possible to be included in those investments in the future? And the bridge logistically will enable our heavy equipment to be moved wherever is necessary. Another important question that we have discussed is that we cannot respond to every single word and sentence of our alliance partners immediately. One must always wait a little, not always be rash and going to panic. We have time to some more direct words of our alliance partners, to wait a little, how to respond, because politics are changing on a daily basis. It's important for Slovakia, however, as we are on a border of a country in war, to settle this conflict as soon as possible. And Slovakia is an advocate, after the Munich conference, I mentioned this already, looking for a permanently sustainable peace. It is not in the interest of Slovakia to achieve ceasefire for some limited time, for resources to be regrouped, for countries to recover, and then again we would see a continuation of military conflict. In our opinion, it's premature now to speak of some kind of militaries or troops of European militaries of some countries who expressed interest to be deployed within Ukraine. We're still not there yet, in my opinion. We still must see some peace conditions and what the guarantees of sustaining such peace would look like. So that's why I must repeat that if Europe, even after the Munich conference, even after the words of representatives of US administration, has to act in more self-confident, without any fear. We are a large, major market, strong economy in the world, so we must not conduct activities that would divide Europe to multiple member state groups of these countries. Because Paris summit, ladies and gentlemen, has even created as though 3 groups of countries. Because, first of all, some countries could not even agree whether they are willing to offer their troops for any peace guarantees in Ukraine in the future. Second group of about 19, there was still some member states missing in this group, EU member states, including those who are neighboring with Ukraine, behind border of which there is war today. That's why I consider these type of talks quite unfortunate, so that we've agreed that with Mr. Secretary General in the future for countries to meet, to have similar opinions about placing troops somewhere, deploying troops, but not to undermine the unity of the EU, and even, I think, reducing the respect and also responsiveness of big world politics players. Because when they see our fragmentation and disunity, this is not helping us, as all have been calling after the Munich conference. We must just face it straight, all of these issues, not lamenting who is talking with whom or not. It's logical for us here in Slovakia that 2 major superpowers open talks, who have the power and diplomatic basic frameworks for future negotiations, have been set up. Of course, a part of these negotiations and talks always must be Ukraine in being involved in a conflict, but I'm convinced that through EU acting in a confidence with own proposal how to make a contribution to sustaining peace, preventing war in the future, EU must be at the negotiation table as well. but not through waiting whether someone will invite it, but through its own initiative and own attitudes, must demand to be seated at such negotiation table. If EU leaders will not be able to present such position of the EU, we will be witnesses of peace be agreed without us. So I'd like to conclude by saying that I'm convinced that sustainable peace in Ukraine will not be possible without any security guarantees, for which also European Union will be responsible, of course, with the support of the United States, because without us, countries living on this continent, any solution could be very brief and unsustainable. So thank you once again, Mr. Secretary General. Many areas that we have discussed, there were really many more areas. Slovakia would like to see more Slovaks in the NATO structures of the NATO headquarters in Brussels. And Slovakia would like to seek the position of having in Slovakia a center of excellence for artillery fire, because Slovakia really is historically excellent expertise in this particular field, where we can test long-range artillery systems, where after some investments already we have made, we are producing a large number of ammunition of various types, where Slovakia is one of the leaders, in fact, in this region, in this regard, and many other topics that we have discussed were very broad-reaching, with the participation of Minister of Defense and Minister of Foreign Affairs. So I'd like to conclude really by saying, once again, Slovakia does realize its place in security strategy is to remain a proper, reliable North Atlantic Alliance member, while realizing here the moral investment debt into completing the equipment of our armed forces. But we're still facing a difficult time to agree on to what percent this needs to be increased for defense expenditures and how rapidly we need to get there. We still have member states among us we have not even got close to 2%. Slovakia has already achieved 2%, and in our next 3 years' budgets, it's planning to retain the minimum of 2%. But we are open to talks to increase these resources. That will, however, require an intense domestic communication to be able to retain for our citizens complex services in healthcare, education and social system. On the other hand, to be able to guarantee one of the most important services, that's the security. That is the obligation of every government to provide, including the Slovak government. Thank you once again very much. Thank you, Mark, for coming. Thank you for being able to see this morning our excellent military training area, Lest, which is one of the unique facilities within the region, not just in Slovakia. And it's a training facility available to all of our alliance partners' militaries. And I believe that the know-how we've discussed today will be also shown in our next future very reliable and good cooperation.
Yes. Mr. President, dear Petter, it's wonderful to be with you here in Bratislava. It's good to be back. Slovakia has been a valued ally now for over 20 years, and you are still that ally. You are very much involved and committed to NATO. You host one of NATO's multinational forward land forces. And indeed, I visited the troops this morning, and it was very impressive. This presence is a vital part of how we collectively deter aggression and defend our eastern flank. Slovakia is also the framework nation for the headquarters Multinational Division Center in Hungary, which became fully operational last week. Alongside Hungary and Croatia, you have worked hard to deliver this project, demonstrating that we are adapting to new challenges and showcasing how working together in NATO bolsters deterrence and defense for us all. Over the past week, Europe has seen an extraordinary level of engagement by the new US administration at NATO headquarters, in Munich, and now in Washington, where your Prime Minister Robert Fico is today. The US has made crystal clear its commitment to a strong NATO. This should not be in doubt. And that commitment comes with an expectation that all NATO allies are contributing their fair share. Defence spending across the alliance is on an upward trajectory. Last year it increased by 20% for Europe and Canada. Slovakia spends 2% of GDP on defence, and this is crucially important. But growing threats will require greater investment. This is part of what we discussed today. We know that the target, the 2014 target of 2%, will not keep us safe in the years ahead. Allies must invest more. Today we also discussed the Russian war against Ukraine. 11 years ago, Russia invaded Crimea. 3 years ago, Putin began his full-scale invasion. He thought it would be over in just a few days. But he underestimated Ukrainian resilience and he underestimated Allied resolve. Ukraine is not just our partner, it is your neighbor. We all want to see an end to the terrible aggression against Ukraine. And it is vital that any deal reached brings an enduring peace. That Russia will never again try to take one more square kilometer of Ukrainian land. This will require robust, as you said, security guarantees. And NATO allies are actively discussing what that might entail. While there is much that still needs to be decided, there is no question that Europe has a vital role to play in securing peace in Ukraine. We have been in close touch with the US administration on this at every level. And we all agree that we need an enduring peace in Ukraine. As US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said last week in Brussels, no Minsk III. It has to be an enduring and lasting peace deal. And the White House Special Envoy consulted with allies in the North Atlantic Council on Monday. That was a very successful meeting. In advance of the meeting with Russian officials this week, and of course he is now himself traveling to Ukraine and is now in Ukraine discussing with the Ukrainian leadership. At the same time, we should continue to strengthen Ukraine's hand so that they can come to the negotiating table from a position of strength. As an alliance, we are delivering on commitments made at the Washington summit. We have surpassed our financial pledge, providing more than 50 billion euros of security assistance in the past year. The command in Wiesbaden is also now operational, coordinating the delivery of training and equipment for Ukraine. Even so, as the full-scale invasion enters in its 4th year, we must dig deeper. The world is becoming more dangerous, but NATO remains ready to deter and defend, to tackle the range of challenges we face together. So again, thank you, dear Peter. Together, NATO is stronger because of Slovakia, and Slovakia is safer because of NATO. Thank you so much.
Nech sa páči, priestor na 2 otázky.
Please, we have room for 2 questions. Slovak Radio. Jana Balková from the Slovak Radio. You are both have said a few moments ago that NATO needs strengthening, needs investment, even though Mr. President of Slovakia has said that the percentages will still be a matter of discussion. I still like to ask, what about countries that somehow have strictly been refusing increased defense expenditures, if they will refuse once agreed? What about those countries? What will happen to them? And what about countries deciding to increase investments but to distribute it, break it down into dual use, for instance? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'm happy that now 23 countries are spending the agreed 2%, and Slovakia is among them. But it's also true that there are still a few countries not spending 2%, and I'm engaging with them actively and intensely to make sure that they speed up reaching the 2%, and I think they all have to do that by next summer. And I tell them, if you do not react to my phone calls, you might get phone calls from a very nice man in Washington who might be less, well, let's say, having less of a time, has more time limit, I guess, on what he wants to achieve. So, if not me, then they might get phone calls from somebody else. We all really have to get to the 2%. That is crucial. Then, of course, we have to decide on the next target, and we will do that in the The Hague NATO summit, and the president will be there. But we will not do it like in 2014 by saying, okay, let's get to a number. We will base it now on a process within NATO, the capability targeting process, which will deliver the gaps between where we are and where we should be. And when you look at those gaps now emerging, but we are not there yet, we are still finalizing all the work, then it is clear that 2% is not enough, that it will be much more. I think it will be considerably more than 3% at least. We'll see where we get to. And then, of course, we also need to decide on a time path. And I think we have to decide on an ambitious time path to get to the new target. So not like in 2014, we decide on 2% and then nothing happened till President Trump was elected. And then all of a sudden, the numbers went up. I think we should now decide on an ambitious time path in The Hague, which will bring us to the new number as soon as possible. Then, of course, there is always the question of what can you count within the spending numbers and what can you not count within the spending numbers. I know there are particular wishes with Slovakia, which I totally understand. I cannot answer now exactly what will be the outcome, but we agreed that we will continue the discussion also at our advisors to see what we can do, what we cannot do. Because in the end, of course, there are rules within NATO, what is part of the spending and what is not. So I totally understand the requirement from Slovakia, but again, we have to make sure that it fits in the system, and we will continue that discussion.
One brief comment. It will not only be important, the volume, the amount of investment money, but the quality of these investments. Because there's a rule in NATO that a minimum of 20% of resources must go to modernization of military forces. I can say with pleasure that in Slovakia we expend 35% for modernization, not only for existence or upkeep or functioning of the militaries. That will also be an important argument for us, not only to increase the total volume of investments, but also to increase the percentage going to modernization and armament. So in my view, the view upon individual member states will not be just through volume and percentage, but also how they meet modernization targets, or whether they are not just eating up the money they invest with no investments into modernization. Slovakia today is achieving 35% annually of all resources into defense going into modernization, which I consider a good result. Slovakia is one of the better NATO member states in this regard. TV Markiza, good afternoon. My name is Kajtarova. Mr. President, yesterday you were criticizing President Macron for Slovakia not being invited to any one of those informal summits held in Paris. Prime Minister Fico said that we have not even been interested in such invitation. Prime Minister said he wouldn't know what he would do there because it was a meeting of friends of war, what he said. Those were his words. So, to both of you gentlemen, I'd like to ask Secretary General and the President whether these words are not in contradiction with what we just said now, what you just said now here, and whether there is no a two-speed Europe as a result now happening. Slovakia will be EU and NATO member, but due to this opinion will be pushed to the fringes as a result. Secretary General is a guest, so please, if you wish to answer first.
Well, let me first say that Slovakia is more integrated than most countries in EU and NATO. You are in Schengen, you are in the Eurozone, you are in the European Union, you are in NATO, and you are a valued member in all of these organizations and sub-organizations. So that has to be absolutely clear. And you can have differences of opinion. We are, EU and NATO are both based on democracy and the understanding that you can have your debates, but in the end we always get together. I was sitting next to you and next to Robert Fico for many years in the European Council, and I knew that when it really was necessary we would always get to an agreement. And this is what you need to have. You're amongst friends. So I'm absolutely not worried about Slovakia's role in NATO or in the EU. When it comes to Paris, exactly as the President said in his introductory remarks, I was a bit irritated in Munich that the reaction of many Europeans was, when the peace initiative was announced in the US. We are not involved, can we be at the table, etc., etc. And I said, organize yourselves, fight yourself to a table, whatever that table exactly entails. That's why it was so important that we had General Kellogg visiting NATO headquarters and briefing the ambassadors last Monday. I think the meeting President Macron organized also has to be seen in that light. And there will be many other meetings. I was on Monday present, I was not on Wednesday present. There might be other meetings where the President of Slovakia is there, I'm not there, somebody else is not there. That is not important. Important is that somehow in Europe we are discussing how to organize the security guarantees into Ukraine post a peace deal. And that is a step-by-step process. As always in Europe, it never immediately brings you to a final joint conclusion, which is not a problem, because we still have some time. But I'm happy that at least in Europe we stopped whining and started acting, getting our act together. And our talks today also very much focused on this. So Paris was not a standalone. It is part of a bigger process. Maybe Slovakia will organize something, or the Poles, or the Brits, we'll see. But step by step we have to make sure that we dialogue, strategize amongst each other to make sure that we positively engaged in what I think is an important initiative from President Trump, which is to get Ukraine to a lasting peace.
Ak dovolíte, ešte to sprecizujem.
I may probably be more precise information. I did not criticize President Macron for not inviting us. That's not what I said, for not inviting Slovakia. I criticized him for strange formats of meetings that he chose. I was at a Munich conference. I saw the panic and after the US Vice President's speech and the bewilderment on faces of European politicians and members there. We must act as a sovereign bloc, Europe, EU. Here we are, a self-confident EU, nearly 500 million people, a very strong internal economic market, and we will want to be part of these negotiations. To convene a summit on Monday with 8 countries, on Wednesday with 19 countries, because it's not that we were not invited. 8 other countries were not invited. So when someone looks at this from behind the ocean, from across the ocean, they are looking, where is this strong, united Europe? With whom are we going to talk? Whom to invite? If they invited us to a meeting of countries wishing to send out, are willing to send out and deploy their troops to Ukraine, as those who will be keeping peace, Slovakia likely has not such interest. So we need not such invitation to such meeting, but a summit convened by President Macron should be a response to US administration saying that if you want to be at the table, do something. I don't consider this very fortunate because it has not shown EU unity. On the contrary, our fragmentation. So big geopolitical players will be viewing us in the same way. That was my criticism. And a question to Prime Minister Fico, whether he is not breaking down our unity by his attitudes and his declarations. I don't think so. I'm not breaking our unity if I'm criticizing President Macron. We are a sovereign EU member state. And even, I have to say this, we must admit this, here all in this room. At the end, the words of Slovak government saying 1 year ago, was saying are coming true. Likely, this will not be a just peace. This will likely not be a very easy road of Ukraine to NATO. And we were criticized very strongly about this 1 year ago. Now it's becoming very close to the reality. Those are words from... And we, on the contrary, have agreed with Secretary General that deeds, actions are important, not statements. And the reality, how Slovakia is acting, does not exclude Slovakia to a margin like a second-class NATO or EU member. Thank you very much for coming. Nice day.